Okay, my presentation follows on nicely, I like to think, from the three that we've already heard this morning, and indeed from yesterday. And I'm asking the question, what else, other than informing and advising the judge, does quasi-sentencing professional work do? I'm calling it quasi-sentencing work because these other agencies are involved in a form of penal decision-making. What else do they do other than inform and advise? And it definitely picks up on some of the themes that have been talked about. So the official purposes, well, I'm going to particularly concentrate on, this is drawing on research from over some years now from different studies on pre-sentence reports and on defence work and plea bargaining and research with judges. But in terms of pre-sentence reports or pre-sentence investigations, it's about giving the judge relevant personal social circumstance information officially. And in the case of defence work, it's about representing the accused's best interests. The second is explicitly mitigatory. The first is arguably implicitly mitigatory. They're both forms of mitigation. But in both cases, I think there has been perpetual and possibly even increasing, at least from some scholarly quarters, anxiety about the real impact, which we were talking about before, the real impact of these things, or are they just mere froth, symbolism, and are they reducing? And there's a sort of tranche of work, I think, from some quarters which is worried that we're seeing a reduction in this kind of mitigatory work and also a reduction of interest in the individual as we see a rise in actuarial justice and so forth, it's said, and risk assessment. I've got three propositions really as to what else quasi-sentencing professionals do, particularly pre-sentence report writers, so whether they're probation or whether they're, the freelance. I think similar situation sometimes with bail reports as well, or whether they be defence. The first is that that this work, although we often think that interprofessional communication does and should break down professional barriers, it may at least as often fortify and strengthen those barriers and professional boundaries, that it may actually do that. It may stimulate greater boundary maintenance. Secondly, that this kind of quasi-sentencing professional work stimulates a kind of tease in the response to attempts to capture and map, survey how judicial sentencing is done. So that's my second proposition. And I'll try to be reasonably brief with these two propositions as we go through them, so as to get on to the third one, which I think I'd like to talk about a little bit longer, which is that this kind of quasi-sentencing work, which is supposed to be assistive and advocacy work, actually, although there's a lot of policy concern, and sometimes professionals will say, oh, we've got another adjournment, in reality, it accelerates the disposal of cases through a kind of expressive moral performance. So the instrumental is served by, if you like, the expressive, or what's sometimes called symbolism. But here I'm saying that it's not symbolism, mere symbolism, something to be dismissed. It's actually absolutely central, instrumentally. But what is a profession anyway? Well, this is the model, which I'm sure you'll be well familiar with, the so-called trait model of the profession. It goes back to T.H. Marshall in the 1930s, Parsons a more sophisticated version, and a kind of deal between an occupation and the state. And this is the model that professions or occupations wanting to be professions claim for themselves. So they're saying, well, we'll get restricted entry, autonomy, and preserves of work, which no one else can do. The state will grant that for us. And in return, the profession will provide skill-based esoteric knowledge based on theory, and we often forget as academics, we are very closely implicated in this. The theory is ultimately drawn on as an important capital resource, a generic theory and principle, skills and ideas, superior ethical standards, which is very important, I'll come back to, client service and public service. Of course, from the 60s, 70s, and 80s onwards, a less benign view of professions emerged in the sociology of the professions. Terence Johnson, for example, in 1972, was very much interested in how occupations become so-called professions. He said, well, a profession is not so much an occupation as such, and he made the important point that often we work backwards. We decide what we think a profession is. We say, well, doctors, they're professions, right? What are the doctors like? We'll define what a profession is based on that. And cart before the horse, he said. Not so much an occupation, but a means of controlling an occupation. And secondly, that we should expect producer-consumer uncertainty and distance. Andrew Abbott, in the late 80s, very much emphasized inter-occupational competition. Drawing on Martine's work from yesterday, you talked to Martine about turf and turf wars and turf competition. Well, Abbott's very much in that tradition, and that there's a struggle for control and territory in occupations. And I like his definition of what a profession is. Professions are, he says, somewhat exclusive groups of individuals applying, and I've emphasized that word applying, somewhat abstract knowledge. Where do they get the abstract knowledge? Usually academic knowledge, in individual cases. And it's that relationship between the abstract knowledge, the generic knowledge, to the particular case, and it's the ability to control that relationship. When does this case fit this principle, and this principle fit this case, like we were talking about last night, probably? That's really where professional power resides, I take Abbott to be saying. And so non-judicial actors, even though they may not do so explicitly, every day are claiming sentencing work, even if they are trying to hide it. Everyone knows that that's what they're doing because they are making assessments about culpability, blameworthiness, as you were saying, Steve. They are making these assessments all the time. They are moral judgments as well. They have to do that. So they are doing that. So there's a claim to sentencing going on there, even though sometimes they wouldn't want to say so. So what does that mean? Well, it takes me to my first proposition, which is that interprofessional advice and interprofessional work also fortifies occupational boundary maintenance. It does so because where there may be a dominant status group, most obviously, certainly in Anglo-American jurisdictions, the judge, we should expect a discrediting. We should expect a discrediting and deriding of alien narratives. That's what we should expect. We should be surprised if it's anything else. Secondly, we should expect servile communication, deferential communication, if it pleads your lordship. If you would be so good as to, if you were to consider a non-cut, then I might, as you were talking about in the reports, the kind of implied advice, has to be done in a very servile way. And judges, of course, detest, in many jurisdictions anyway, the talk of influence. They rage about the idea, don't try to influence me. But of course, at the same time, they're contradictory about that because they want relevant information. So messages have to be encoded and therefore weakened. Secondly, the attempt of, particularly by policymakers and academics, to try to get a handle on sentencing through the use, for example, of pre-sentence reports, as it's done, to try to, for example, bring about penal reduction, to encourage less use of custody. What it also does is to elicit a certain tease, whereby, and I'm not necessarily saying this is a conscious thing, but whereby the judge can't be captured. The judicial process is far too slippery for that. So there's a certain promise of the reveal. I'm going to show all, and you'll find out, and we're hoping there's a policy expectation that will happen. But in fact, it never quite does, and we're perpetually frustrated, aren't we? We've done decades of research trying to find out what does sentencing really look like, and we find it's as slippery as ever, and it's contradictory and it's ambivalent. That's not to say there have been moves forward. I perhaps exaggerate the point, but it remains essentially very slippery, as we've been saying today. Now, in pre-sentence reports in a number of jurisdictions, at least, perhaps not all, the idea, there's been a presupposition that if you have better reports, it will lead to more influence. So quality, if you give judges what they want, you'll become more influential. That's been the idea, and it remains a very, very powerful idea, particularly in probation circles, I think. And it will lead to greater influence. This is, I think, premised on the idea that quality is a destination, you can arrive at it, something achievable. It's a bit like arriving into Reims station yesterday. It's somewhere you know where you're going, and eventually one day we're going to make progress and we'll get there. Whereas I think, arguably, because of this tease, because it's the response is so contradictory and agile in this attempt to capture and apprehend a judicial sentencing, it's a kind of pursuit of desire. And I like the word desire because desire means ever to want. It's an unfulfilled, ever to, it's a pursuit. So it's rather than a arrival at a destination, it's something more like a mirage, that we keep going, and in the distance at some point we will achieve our goal, our destination. And the third proposition, which I'll discuss, oh sorry, I beg your pardon, just to say a little bit, I'm drawing on here, also developing this idea from Bauman's work, some of you will be familiar with, Consuming Life, in 2007. He talks about, we're now a consumer society and so forth. Having been a society of producers, we're now a society of consumers. There's a certain logic, in other words. And the important thing is, when you posit the idea of a judge as a consumer, as that policy discourse does, give judges what they want, they are the consumers, you're then into, I would suggest, a kind of logic which will mean further that we will never be able to apprehend. We will never be able to get a grip on and satisfy those desires. And what does Bauman say about consumer society? The desire must remain ungratified, and this is perhaps the important bit. Consumer society thrives, he says, as long as it manages to render the non-satisfaction of its members, and so on its own terms their unhappiness, perpetual. Now we all know that, don't we? That consumption doesn't make you happy. It's almost a cliche. There's those adverts. They must tell you you're missing something in your life and that you're ultimately not quite gratified, but this product will gratify it for you. But of course, as soon as you get that product, you have to be sold something else, and you need to buy something else in order to be happy. So it goes on. It's perpetual, he says. The yawning gap between promise and delivery is neither a sign of malfunction of the consumer society, nor a side effect of its neglect or mistaken calculation. It is a necessary condition of a properly functioning consumer society. It's absolutely necessary. If the search for fulfillment is to go on, and if new promises are to be alluring and catching, hopes of fulfillment need to be regularly frustrated. So that means that when we posit the idea of the judge as the sovereign consumer, that there must be, as Bauman says, an insatiability of desires and instability of needs. And I think we can see that very, very clearly in the ways in which judges talk about what they want from the process of mitigation. That it's often contradictory and it's unstable. It's a kind of shifting target. So we get a continual promise of new solutions, new products, new alternatives to custody. We're particularly prone to this in Scotland and indeed England and Wales. I think in Scotland we've got more alternatives, or had, than anywhere else in the world. We keep repackaging them. But they're essentially the same thing. We get another rebranding exercise in the hope that will give us what we want. But as Bauman says, products have an inbuilt obsolescence. The one moment when we're happiest, and I include myself here, I'm so happy when I chuck out the old junk and persuade my wife we can clear out some of the stuff, take it to the charity shop. I'm just delighted, and Bauman talks about this. This is the moment of happiness, and we look forward to there's going to be a new horizon. And of course, the junk's only cleared in order that I can go and buy more junk to then put in the cellar that we don't really use. And once again, we're disappointed. So consumption relies on disappointment and the inability to gratify desires. But of course, Bauman says we're all consumers. So judges are also, we are also consumers of judicial needs. Thirdly, my third proposition is that quasi-sentencing work manages the felt gap problem. What do I mean by the gap problem? I'm sure you're familiar. The gap between the theory of law, for example, the ideals of law, and the grubby reality. Now, the grubby reality is marked in criminal sentencing for the most part, except at the very, very highest level, by an abruptness, a speed, and a sense of discourtesy. Law in the books as opposed to action. Of course, the gap problem, as McBarnett and Wandel have said, is inherent in law. It must, we shouldn't expect anything else. There will, in a sense, talking about it as gap is wrong because the rules will necessarily be that way. But my question is slightly different from that, which is this: how do professionals, particularly legal professionals, lawyers and judges particularly, cope with it? Now, you might say, well, they cope with it because why should they care? Well, I would argue that they have to care, logically and empirically as well, that there is my starting point is that we like to see ourselves in a positive light, don't we? But particularly professionals, and through how we believe others perceive us. So we find ways to justify changes in our professional work, and I've documented this elsewhere in legal aid work, where lawyers once said, if you bring in such and such a change, that will be an anathema to justice, that will be disastrous, and then they find they have to work with it, and then they find ways to justify it, in a way that Yannick was talking about just earlier on, the kind of ways of using different discourses to legitimate what you're doing. There's an awkward awareness of this gap. Just the sort of things that people say all the time. I'm sure you're familiar with this in the lower level, what we call summary courts or the non-jury triable courts, where 95% of cases are heard or more. On a practical level, sometimes you don't have as much time, this is a defense solicitor, as much time as when you're doing summary work, legal aid work, which is all that, as perhaps you should with individuals. Embarrassed about it. Other people constantly talking about it as a factory, as a sausage machine. It's not what it was. An embarrassment about it. There should be more resources, but that's what we've got to cope with. And the other way it's often explained is explanations to novices. The way that trainees are told, well, this is how it really is. You've just come out of law school, but this is the reality, I'm afraid, of it. It's really not that good. It's a bit, but what can we do? So the assembly line image is very, very prominent, I suggest, in the minds of lawyers and judges, and they're uncomfortable about it. So the gap problem presents them with a menace. It's a danger. It's a menace partly to their professional self-image. Justice professionals, as I'd like to call them, lawyers and judges, although social workers and others are also, but justice professionals, if you just said, oh, well, who cares, there's a gap between the ideals and reality, I would suggest business people could do that. They could say, well, that's my job to make money, that's what I do. But I would say a justice professional can't do that. It would make the job untenable. Firstly, because professionals, as we've seen, have to claim superior ethical standards. But justice professionals, legal professionals, have to do more than that. They're not just accountants or whatever. They are in charge of justice. They are custodians of justice. And they are responsible for, judges have the power of coercion. And of course, as we know, coercion without legitimation is just violence. That's all it is. There's an enduring sense of guilt, shame, and embarrassment. How do they deal with that? I think it's particularly exemplified at all stages of the process, but particularly in the point of admitting guilt. Now, summary processes in most countries, I think, rely on, and I'm avoiding using the Anglo-American term guilty plea, I'm trying to use a generic term here, admissions of guilt. They rely on admissions of guilt, confessions, or guilty pleas. Now, there are differences, and we can talk about that. But they rely heavily on admissions of guilt. The ideal, the paradigm version, is a full, free, and sincere version, where the defendant's voice is then heard, often through a third party, such as a report or a defense lawyer, and they take or are seen to take individual responsibility. There's a degree of mitigation on personal grounds, not on social grounds, and you get a sense of closed guilt. It means that things can be disposed of more quickly. However, one often encounters a more disruptive version, where professionals are aware of resistance. There could be straight denial by the accused. I didn't do it. A threat of worse, sort of thing you're interested in, Jay, or where Yannick was talking about remand. Well, if I don't plead guilty, I could be faced with a trial tax or a heavier sentence. Or I'm on remand, and that comes up time and again. Remand is a major driver for guilty pleas and confessions. I'm unsure and confused what's going on. There's a certain fatalism, or I feel the system's arbitrary, why should I bother? And a conscious non-engagement or disengagement, which is kind of threatening. that leads to a kind of exculpation or a denial of moral responsibility, and that's problematic because it means open guilt, a sense of openness. Lots of examples here from some recent work I've been doing in interviews with accused, illustrating that point, but I think we'll skip over that in the interest of time. You'll be well familiar with that. So how is this dealt with? I would argue that this is dealt with, this sense of awkwardness and embarrassment, which is perhaps well-founded in what many defendants say, through a display of individualization, a public display of individualization. The summary process is notoriously abrupt, as I've said, so there's this felt legitimacy gap. So you have to be seen, the admission has to be seen to be free and sincere. And here I'd like to draw on the work of Everett Hughes' concept of dirty work, which some of you will be familiar with from the 50s and 60s, and Ashforth and Kreiner, who have developed this a little bit more. They talk about work which is necessary but tainted and polluting, work which is viscerally repugnant to us. We get a kind of gut response. Now the repugnance isn't an objective thing. It is, of course, socially constructed, about social ideas of purity and pollution. And just draws a little bit on Mary Douglas's work on that as well. But socially constructed standards, they are socially constructed standards. So just to give a few examples before we then come on to this kind of quasi-professional, quasi-sentencing work. Well, in order to consume the things that we enjoy and that make us feel good, we know that we need this, the landfill sites, or at least the recycling centres. They're obnoxious places. Somebody has to do that job. Somebody has to drive that digger. And it stinks. It's repugnant, or the work and we don't even like to look at it very much. When I drive by on the motorway out to Lanarkshire, Fiona and Neil and Joe will know, there's a big landfill site. You put the the windows up and the vents down, and I feel repulsed. Somebody has to do that job, and we don't want to see it. We don't want to smell it. We don't want to sense it. Physically dirty work, a nice steak like last night, of course, requires something, again, we don't particularly like to see, which is the abattoir. Socially dirty work. Well, in order to continue to do the kind of rat race, do the longer hours that we all are expected to do, and be more agile in our work further away from our families and all the rest of it, well, what happens to our parents and our grandparents and so forth? Somebody's got to do that work. I'm not trying to make us feel guilty here, but somebody has to do that work when people are suffering, the old folk are suffering from dementia, and they maybe get aggressive, or they say stupid things, or they start swearing, and it's embarrassing. And somebody has to do that kind of work, so they're way off, out of sight in old people's homes in our culture. And we get angry when we hear stories about how they're not treated right by the people who are supposed to look after them. And morally dirty work, well, I would suggest an example of that, in order to have finality in our cases, in order to feel a sense of closure of guilt, that relies on a sense that someone somewhere has done the individualizing work that's necessary to feel that the process of justice has been done. And that work is often done by social workers or the third sector and so forth, or by defense agents. So, the important thing here is that in order to achieve that dirty work, or that dirty work achieves the knowledge that that dirty work has been carried out, it must be done backstage, and the knowledge that it's done achieves a display of humanity, a sense of their participation, some voice, and individualization. And even the complaints that you sometimes hear about, and we kind of touched on them when we hear about complaints about social work reports, about how they're excessively individualized, and judges will often talk about them being absurdly individualized, you know. And there's a story. Have you heard this, Fiona? That they will often talk about, oh, you know, there's even been a report, they talked about how the child was born, that they were born by caesarean section. Now, this may or may not be true that there was such a report, but they like to talk about that. And I would suggest the reason why they like to, because they do that, is not only complaint, but it's also a celebration of individualization, the supposed individualization. It's not really, but the supposed individualization which has gone on, and it makes professionals feel better about what they're doing. So it performs a context as well, so it's not just purely individualistic. Anyone who goes to summary courts, even my first year students, when you take them, the one thing that they can notice is the massive demographic divide, that class divide, that almost everyone is unemployed. And you go to the States, almost everyone's black or Hispanic, right? Almost everyone's unemployed. You can clearly see that they're in poverty. You look at their teeth, they look malnourished, and all the rest of it. Of course, justice professionals are well aware of that. And so this process of individualization performs a nod to distributive justice, to say, well, we'll take some account of that. We're aware of deprivation, even though, in fact, often it's so common as to be ignored. It's kind of you were saying, I think, Louise, in another context. So I think what we have then is a sense of closure facilitated by openness. I kind of don't know if I'm getting your stuff right, following Lumen. I've only ever been understanding Lumen through your work, Rasmus. That closure through a display of openness. So morally dirty work of individualization, I'd like to suggest, forms a protective function. So the defense lawyer is performing a protective function for the judge, but increasingly that's delegated to social workers. And then it gets delegated again to the third sector, to students and all the rest of it. Because it's stories about addiction and poverty and a sense of inevitably the whole legitimacy of the justice process, and indeed, if you like, wider society, is called into question. Of course it is. But that morally dirty work performs a kind of cleansing ritual or routine. It seemed to have cleansed the case, or it seemed to have done something that then allows it to come back in from backstage to front stage. That job has been done, and we can move on. But it must be kept backstage and as much out of sight as possible. So it enables justice professionals, judges especially, to some extent lawyers as well, to see themselves perform as they would prefer to be seen, or as they would like people, as they like to believe they are seen. I'll skip over these quotes. So you get, very briefly, also a transformation in this moral cleansing work, which is very interesting in what Louise was talking about, the guilt processes, and indeed Yannick. You get a straight denial often being turned into an admission. Don't have time to document that here today, but a threat of something, when I'm talking about something worse, often being turned in reports and mitigation into it being allowed to be seen that the defendant is just playing a game. Oh, and he's admitted it now because he knows that there'll be a discount. It's a tactical admission. Whereas actually, in fact, what the defendant was talking about was fear of something else, like being kept on remand. But it's transformed. So this dirty work transforms the case. There's a sense of unsureness, not sure what's going on, is often transformed to being in denial, as it's called. And there's work to be done. Fatalism is transformed into he accepts his fate, which is different. Different from that kind of disengagement. He accepts his fate as if it's again, legitimizing. A conscious non-engagement just to being responsibilized. So, conclusions and then a few questions. So, I would say it performs this work as well as advising. Yes, it does that and represents. It also fortifies boundary maintenance and relative status. It elicits a certainties in the attempt to apprehend judicial sentencing. It's so slippery. It teases us as well. And we continue in the cycle of what Bowen talked about, trying to buy new products, new risk assessment tools, all the rest of it, the latest shiny thing. It's supposed to do the job. And generally, but not always, manage the felt gap problem. I'm not talking about, if you like, an objective one, but the felt gap problem, felt by professionals, enabling a sense of moral closure so they can dispose of cases, because they wouldn't be able to otherwise, ultimately. And so it's largely legitimating, but it also reopens moral problems. And when it does reopen that moral problem, it means, which perhaps in some ways, Hudson, the late Barbara Hudson, talked about that we should always punish in bad conscience. So a nice way of putting it. By bringing those problems to, if you like, front stage, the court, it means that we are more likely to punish in bad conscience. So is that kind of moral dirty work too protective, I suppose one could ask the question. A few questions I'd like your help with, of course, and if you think any of this has any traction. First of all, if this is procedural, I prefer the word processual justice, because procedural sounds something formal. Tyler talks about, who is it procedural for? Who's this catharsis for? Who's it making feel better? Certainly the legal professionals, or justice professionals, feel better because they believe the defendants feel better, whether the defendant does or not. Sometimes I think they do, sometimes they don't, but that dissatisfaction is often managed out in the dirty work. Do high-profile examples, alternatives and so on, which are actually marginal, actually enable business to carry on as usual? So, for example, we were talking about corroboration last night. We were talking about that yesterday afternoon. Corroboration, evidential issues, for example. At the higher level, the fact that we concentrate so much on that, and this kind of draws on Barnett's famous 2 tiers of justice idea to some extent, does it enable us to then carry on the business as usual in the 98% of cases going through, but nearly all of them are guilty pleas or admissions? And also problem-solving courts in some jurisdictions. Well, in some jurisdictions, they're still pilots, but they get a huge amount of publicity. Why is that? Perhaps because they seem to be individualizing. It's a display of individualization that we like to talk about. We don't talk about, we take our students to summary courts, and the one thing the professionals always say to me is, why do you want to take them to a summary court? There's a jury trial going on there. And I say, oh, no, I think summary court's really interesting. Oh, no, it's just the dross. You don't want to see that. Are mass free admissions universal? I've avoided the word guilty plea, but from what I understand, many other countries also use confessions. Confessions seem to be vital in order to, if you like, in nearly all cases, to get through the work as it's seen anyway, but I would argue morally they are vital in order to get through the work. And within that, I was thinking of you, Stuart, what you would say. What difference do inquisitorial systems make? Do they make a difference? In what way? What difference do lay judges make? What difference do panels make, actually? We're talking about panels of judges. What difference do they make? Is that sense, if I'm right, that all systems, if they rely on mass production of admissions, and if there is that sense of professional awkwardness about it and embarrassment, then, and if I'm right, therefore, that is achieved through a display of individualization, it won't always be done in the same way in different jurisdictions. In Scotland, it's done at mitigation. In other countries, it might be done pre-sentence, pre-conviction even. It might be done by the police. It might be done by the third sector. I'm interested to know whether you think it might be done in other ways. And finally, does a low sense of individualization, if all this is right, it may not be, but does a low sense of individualization among justice professionals, if they feel there isn't much individualization, lead to legitimation strain? In other words, an anxiety that you're taking part in a process which you may not feel happy about, and you may not feel is legitimate. That's more than enough. Thank you.